She believed she was in control from the very beginning. Every word she chose, every silence she deployed, every emotional push and pull, it was all calculated, or at least it felt that way to her. There's a certain psychological intoxication that comes with influencing another person's emotions. It creates the illusion of power. And illusion is the key word here, because what she mistook for control was, in reality, dependence on his reactions. You see, control only exists as long as the other person continues to respond. The moment he stops reacting, truly stops, not out of anger, but out of clarity, that entire structure collapses. And that's exactly what happened. He didn't argue. He didn't chase. He didn't try to win her back. He simply stepped out of the dynamic. And in doing so, he removed the very foundation of her perceived power. From a psychological perspective, this is where the shift becomes brutal. Because now she is left alone with herself. No mirror to manipulate, no emotional feedback to shape, just silence. And in that silence, truth begins to emerge. The truth that control was never real. It was borrowed. It depended entirely on someone else's willingness to engage. This is deeply unsettling for someone who has built their identity around influence and dominance in relationships. Because without someone to control, they are forced to confront something far more uncomfortable: their own lack of inner stability. The game ends, and what remains is not power, but emptiness. And here lies the paradox. What she thought made her strong was actually the very thing that made her fragile, because real strength is not found in controlling others, but in mastering oneself. And that is a skill she never developed. So when he walked away, he didn't just leave her, he took the illusion with him. She never truly believed he would leave, not in a final, irreversible way. In her internal narrative, he was already categorized, predictable, emotionally invested, someone who would bend but never break. And that assumption became the foundation of how she treated him. The tests, the distance, the calculated coldness, it all relied on one quiet belief: he will stay. This is where the psychological blind spot reveals itself. When you become accustomed to someone's patience, you begin to mistake it for weakness. When someone consistently chooses understanding over reaction, you start to believe they have no limit. But every human being has a threshold. The difference is some people don't announce it. They simply act when it's reached. And when he reached that point, he didn't explode. He didn't create drama or demand closure. He did something far more unsettling. He detached, calmly, completely. That kind of exit is difficult to process because it offers no emotional handles to grab onto. There's no argument to revisit, no words to twist, no chaos to pull him back into, just absence. For her, this creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. The version of him she believed in, the one who needed her, who revolved around her, no longer exists. And now she's forced to reconcile two conflicting realities: the man she thought she understood, and the man who walked away without looking back. This is where the ego begins to fracture. Because it's not just about losing him, it's about losing the certainty she had about her own power. If he could leave, then perhaps she was never as in control as she believed. Perhaps she misjudged not only him, but herself. And that realization doesn't arrive gently. It lingers. It echoes. It rewrites the entire story she once felt so confident in. Because in the end, the most dangerous assumption you can make about someone is that they'll never choose to live without you. What follows next is not just emotional discomfort. It is something far deeper, far more destabilizing. It is the collapse of the ego. An ego, in this context, is not arrogance in the simple sense. It is the identity she constructed around being desired, being in control, being the one who could not be left. When he walked away, he didn't just remove his presence, he disrupted that identity. Because if she is no longer the one being chased, no longer the center of someone's emotional world, then who is she within that dynamic? This is the question the ego resists at all costs. It would rather distort reality than accept a loss of significance. So the mind begins to defend itself. It rationalizes, it tells her he was weak, that he couldn't handle her, that he was never worthy in the first place. But these narratives don't bring relief. They are temporary shields against a much sharper truth trying to surface. She was rejected. Not loudly, not dramatically, but definitely. And rejection, especially when it comes from someone she believed she had power over, creates a kind of internal fracture because it contradicts everything she thought she knew about her influence. The ego cannot easily integrate that contradiction, so it oscillates between denial and obsession, between superiority and quiet insecurity. This is why the silence becomes so heavy. There is no external validation to stabilize her sense of self, no reaction to reaffirm her importance. And without that, the ego begins to turn inward, questioning, replaying, dissecting every moment. Questioning, replaying, dissecting every moment. Not out of growth, but out of a desperate attempt to restore the image it once held. But here is the deeper psychological reality. What is collapsing is not her worth, but the illusion built around it. And illusions, no matter how convincing, are fragile by nature. So the real question is not why it hurts, but whether she is willing to face what remains when the illusion is gone. In the aftermath of that collapse, there is often a predictable move, replacement, not reflection, not integration, but substitution. She seeks new attention, new validation, new emotional stimuli to fill the space he left behind. On the surface, it appears effective. There are conversations, compliments, distractions. The external world responds, and for a moment, it feels like control has been restored. But psychologically, something doesn't align, because what she lost was not merely a person, it was a particular kind of presence. Someone who saw through her patterns yet chose to stay. Someone who offered depth rather than just attention. And depth is not easily replicated. It cannot be manufactured on demand, nor replaced through quantity. Yet the mind, unwilling to sit with absence, attempts to override this truth by accumulating alternatives. This is where the internal conflict intensifies. Outwardly, she may appear to have moved on. Inwardly, there is a quiet comparison taking place. Every new interaction is measured, often unconsciously, against what she once had. And the more she tries to convince herself that it's the same or better, the more apparent the difference becomes. Because genuine connection leaves an imprint. It reshapes expectations. It alters what feels real. And once that standard is experienced, superficial dynamics begin to feel hollow, no matter how stimulating they may initially seem. So the cycle continues, seeking, engaging, detaching, not because she is fulfilled, but because she is avoiding the one thing that cannot be bypassed, the need to confront what was lost and why it mattered. And here lies the deeper paradox. The more she tries to escape the void through replacement, the more defined that void becomes. Because absence, when ignored, does not disappear. It sharpens. At some point, distraction loses its power. And when it does, she is left with a realization that no amount of external attention can silence. What was real cannot be replaced, only understood. And then there is the silence. Not the strategic silence she once used as a tool, but a different kind entirely. One that does not respond does not bend, does not break. This silence is not a tactic. It is an absence of engagement. And psychologically, that distinction changes everything. Before, silence was a form of control. It was meant to provoke a reaction, to pull him back in, to create uncertainty that she could then resolve. It was active, intentional, and dependent on his emotional involvement. But now, the silence she faces is not designed to achieve anything. It simply exists. And because of that, it cannot be manipulated. This is where the discomfort deepens. Human beings are wired to seek feedback. We look for signals, approval, rejection, even conflict, to orient ourselves within a relationship. But when there is nothing, no signal at all, the mind begins to generate its own noise. Questions arise, interpretations multiply, and without any external response to anchor them, they spiral. For her, this becomes suffocating, because the same absence she once created to destabilize him is now destabilizing her. There is no message to decode, no emotional entry point to reestablish connection. Just a closed door with no indication of what lies behind it. And in that space, something unexpected begins to happen. The focus shifts. Without his reactions to monitor or influence, she is left with her own internal dialogue. The silence becomes a mirror, reflecting thoughts she may have avoided about her actions, her patterns, her need for control. This is not comfortable. In fact, it can feel overwhelming because silence, when it is real, removes all distractions. It forces a kind of confrontation that cannot be postponed indefinitely. And this is the irony she cannot escape. The very silence she once used to maintain power has now become the one thing she has no power over. So the question becomes unavoidable. When there is nothing left to control, what remains to face? And eventually, when the noise of distraction fades and the silence has done its work, what remains is something far more difficult to escape: regret. Not the superficial kind that passes quickly, but a deeper, more persistent awareness that something meaningful was mishandled. Regret operates differently from the earlier stages. It is no longer about control or ego or even replacement. It is about recognition. The mind begins to revisit moments with a clarity that wasn't available before. Things she once dismissed now appear significant. Words she used carelessly begin to carry weight. Patterns she justified start to reveal their cost. This is the mind attempting to reconcile what happened with what could have been. And in doing so, it creates a quiet but constant tension, because she can now see the value of what she lost, but only from a distance that cannot be crossed. There is also a subtle shift in responsibility. Earlier, it was easy to externalize, to blame him, the timing, the circumstances. But regret has a way of dissolving those defenses. It turns the focus inward, not as punishment, but as clarity. And that clarity can be uncomfortable because it removes the protection of denial. What makes this stage particularly heavy is the realization that some opportunities are not cyclical. Not everything returns. Not every person re-enters your life to give you another chance to get it right. And when that truth settles in, it brings with it a sense of finality. Yet, within that finality, there is also potential, if it is faced honestly. Because regret, when acknowledged rather than avoided, can become instructive. It can reveal patterns that need to change, tendencies that must be understood, and behaviors that cannot be repeated without consequence. But that transformation is not automatic. It requires a willingness to confront oneself without distortion. And that is the final turning point. Because in the end, the pain of losing something real is not meant to break you. It is meant to show you what you can no longer afford to take lightly again.